I think you all understand that any colloquium conference has to be planned long in advance, and we, like most of the elite, thought we would be celebrating not only Rachel Carson's entry onto the American scene as one of the great historic literary and environmental figures with her first book, Under the Sea Wind, which was published almost exactly 75 years ago to this day, but that we would also be gathering and hearing from our speakers and panelists and from all of you on how do we move the environmental and the peace agenda forward. How do we help, support, maybe even push a different president-elect who would have been Hillary Clinton. And so the tone and what we need to think about has shifted some. But I think, as Rachel is our guiding spirit today, we would understand that she not only celebrated nature, she not only had a tremendous sense of science and communicating it, as Chris said, she also faced very difficult times. Let me remind you, and I should warn you, those of you who have made the mistake of signing up with the Rachel Carson Council will be receiving an appeal. This event is free, but you pay later. But we didn't do that. What is it? Cyber Tuesday giving. How many emails did you have in your inbox? But in there, what that message talks about, it says basically Rachel Carson lost the election. Her values, her vision. But it goes on to say that she kept on going. So I think there's at least one person in the room who remembers Rachel Carson's first candidate, her first presidential campaign, her great hopes that this candidate would take on a conservationist agenda and carry on what had been built by Teddy Roosevelt and FDR. His name was Adlai Stevenson. And in 1952, he got buried. There are a couple of people. In 1956, as you know, Adlai Stevenson ran again. Rachel Carson campaigned for him, she worked for him, and by this time she was not only concerned about the environment, but open-air nuclear testing and trying to do something about the Cold War and proliferation. And the rivers were burning, the skies were polluted, and by this time, shortly thereafter, she was not told, but first diagnosed with breast cancer, and then it metastasized. And so this woman, who we are celebrating today, lost and lost and lost, and during that period, she wrote Silent Spring, she wrote The Sea Around Us, she wrote The Edge of the Sea, she wrote bestsellers, and she worked politically with her friends who were scientists and environmentalists and organizations, and kept going until she campaigned for a guy named John F. Kennedy. And she ended up working, as you know, with Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior, with JFK on the task forces. Her information was brought into the White House directly, and she had the opportunity then, as we thought we would, to walk and work directly into the White House. That opportunity is gone, but it means that we will carry on as Rachel did and build a stronger movement. Some of you are writers, some of you are lobbyists, some of you head environmental organizations, lawyers, people in the visual arts. We are all needed to protect the environment that Chris was talking about. There are a couple of big themes that I hope we will weave through this event. On the one hand, we're going to celebrate because we are the direct heirs of Rachel Carson. People in this room, not just people on staff at the Rachel Carson Council, many of you, some of you knew Rachel Carson, you knew her successors at the Rachel Carson Council, Shirley Briggs and others, or you have worked with other organizations for a long, long time. We are the broad movement that Rachel Carson, she not only was awarded by, she worked with Defenders of Wildlife, National Wildlife, Audubon Society, Sierra Club, Wilderness Society. These were all folks, the Conservation Foundation. I'm probably leaving some out. She read all their materials. She worked with all of them. She helped and corresponded, no email, with all of them. And that created the roots of the movement of which we are a part. And so I am really happy to celebrate. I want to tell you the themes. One is a sense of wonder. The technical name of this event is A Sense of Wonder, the National Jubilee and Civic Colloquium. I think you all understand that Rachel developed her values, her imagination, her concern for other creatures, other people, as she toddled around with her mother, a brilliant woman who was a teacher. She had been the best student ever at the the Washington Female Seminary. Rachel's mom was so smart. They let her take a couple of courses at the actual men's college that was nearby. Yeah, this was turn of the 19th, 20th century. And so she was a brilliant teacher, and as soon as she got married, she had to quit. Those were the rules. And so she poured all of her passion, her imagination, her learning, her science, her religious values that she got from her father, a Presbyterian learned minister who actually cared about people, social responsibility, those sorts of things. And all of that was aimed into Rachel Carson, the youngest and clearly favorite child. So out there in where Rachel grew up, outside of Pittsburgh, at the early age, she rambled through the woods around the farm with her mom, and her mother used a curriculum written by another amazing woman named Anna Botsford Comstock, which was a nature study curriculum that went through 14 editions until 1938. My second grade teacher used it. People still use this book. Its thesis is pretty clear, that if you take young children and develop a sense of wonder and awe and imagination and concern in loving and observing all those little critters, not only will they learn science much better than if you force them to learn Latinate genus names. Some of you probably didn't like that part, right? It will build their character. They won't want to hurt or harm or murder or shoot these little beings. And it creates an ethic that leads to understanding and appreciating the other. If you can love some little critter, you learn to develop empathy for the creatures and people on this planet. And so that sense of wonder is not simply, oh, isn't this exciting to see a rabbit? It's to try to learn what these rabbits do. How do they come to be? What miracle is this? How wondrous. And then you're not going to want to gut it and hang it from a wall. That's a key piece of what I think we need to hang on to. It's why we have authors, writers here today, a panel on a sense of wonder. We need to communicate this not only to children and young people, but hold on to it for ourselves. It's very easy, I think, to become Trumpized. How many of you have been pretty angry in the last few weeks? Oh. Now, anger's fine, but of course, you don't want to end up at that point where you want to crush those people, those nasty, stupid people who ruined the election. That's a tough one. But the ability to try to understand our fellows and not get into crushing the other is central to Rachel Carson's beliefs, her ethic, her writing. At the same time, you know, she was a wonderfully trained scientist at Johns Hopkins, at Woods Hole. The right wing still likes to attack Rachel to this day. I am answering questions from students around the country. You're with the Rachel Carson Council. Could you tell me if Rachel really committed genocide against the Africans? Oh, yeah. Well, we won't try to refute that right now. Suffice to say, because Rachel was responsible for banning DDT, and DDT prevents malaria, and it's all over Africa, when it was banned, she caused genocide. It's a far-right, nutty version, and if you can topple Rachel Carson from her pedestal or off the mountaintop, all of us by association are non-scientists, hysterical women, communists, and so on. That's what's behind it. I didn't mean to digress on that, but get ready for it throughout the day. Suffice to say, I worked on the Stockholm Convention, the Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty that dealt with banning incredibly toxic chemicals that had been banned in the United States and then were banned internationally. The treaty took effect in 2004. There is a public health emergency exemption for DDT carefully applied indoors if there's a public health emergency. It was not banned, step one. It also, there were mosquitoes developing resistance, and it was less and less effective even back in Rachel's day. And it wasn't used widely in Africa at the time. It was far more successful being used in other parts of the world. In some, it's all based on a tissue of non-fact and lies that Rachel faced in her day and we face again in ours. Last word of welcome and trying to set the scene. So we need this sense of wonder. We need the science that Rachel was wonderful about. She's attacked as a non-scientist because she didn't finish her PhD. You probably know she had a full fellowship to Hopkins. It wasn't enough to cover her tuition. She was caring for her mother, her father, her sister's children. She had 3 part-time jobs. She had 2 adjunct positions at University of Maryland, teaching undergraduate biology, also at Hopkins undergraduate, University of Maryland School of Dentistry, teaching biology, and she was a half-time research assistant for the most prominent biologists of the time at Hopkins. Didn't leave a lot of time, and she commuted by bus from Baltimore to College Park and back. So she had to stop and get a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and thank God she did. And Mark Madison is here, is going to talk a little bit about Rachel's background and how it came to be that she developed into this incredible person who had connected to every piece of research available to the government at the time. And I will say, before we bring Mark up here, that Rachel Carson, I have learned, I speak at a lot of campuses, undergraduates and younger faculty do not know who she is. So I try to explain that. Those who do know say things like, she the something about birds, DDT, I say, that's right. And then when I explain that Rachel cared also about nuclear weapons and open-air nuclear testing, that happened because she read all the materials through her friend Roger Revelle, who she had known during the war, when we did nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946, Operation Crossroads. Surplus Navy ships are tethered, 1 atomic bomb blown up under the ships, 1 dropped from a B-29. Aboard are little test animals dying and squealing, and plants, and they measured all the effects of radiation on board, out in the water, etc. Rachel was horrified, and from at least 1946 on, spent her time opposing open-air nuclear testing and nuclear weapons, and also the nuclear wastes that go with it. She also cared about global climate change. This is a trick question I use with undergraduates. You know, I do my Ferris Bueller bit. You know, anyone, did Rachel Carson know about climate change? Bueller? And some guy like, who's Rachel Carson? The answer is because she knew Roger Revelle and worked on oceanography with him in World War II, it is Roger Revelle, you all know, who was Al Gore's teacher at Harvard in 1966, who taught Al about global climate change. It is Roger Revelle who got the funding and with Charles Keeling built a facility atop the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii to measure carbon emissions. All of this was known to Rachel. All of it was then communicated to the Kennedy administration, which was concerned about it. Then there were official pronouncements after Kennedy was shot in the Johnson administration. That's not counting Jimmy Carter and classmate and friend of mine, Gus Speth, who worked on this with Jimmy Carter in the 70s. So here we are. Rachel Carson not only cared about pesticides and toxic chemicals, and we'll hear from Tom Udall later about that, she cared about nuclear weapons, nuclear power, nuclear waste, global climate change, and pigs. I know, it's totally bizarre, right? We're going to have a panel a little later in the day in which the Rachel Carson Council is organizing and working in North Carolina in particular. We're beginning to work more in Maryland and a couple of other states on the problems of CAFOs, confined area feeding operations, factory farms, industrial animal agriculture, hogs and chickens. And Rachel Carson wrote the introduction, a powerful one, to the first expose of CAFOs in 1964. And we'll hear a little bit more about that when we talk about those CAFOs, and we'll have people joining us from North Carolina, from those communities who work there, and they are seen as the other, because these CAFOs are not in Bethesda. They're where poor and minority people, African Americans, Latinos, in North Carolina and elsewhere. And Rachel Carson's ethic is absolutely central. She shared a reverence for life with Albert Schweitzer. Many of you are old enough to know who Albert Schweitzer is, and I'll skip that part. But this reverence for life begins in childhood with that sense of wonder, led around by mom or sometimes dad, a beloved teacher, reading imaginative books, going outside, and beginning to feel for rabbits and bugs and birds and butterflies and the wonder of it all. And that is what leads you to care about people you've never met in North Carolina, who don't live in the lovely city and suburbs of Washington. That's why I often say to people, if you're going to pollute and destroy and let chemicals and things go all amok, never pick on rich people. Rachel's friend Marjorie Spock helped bring the first lawsuit against DDT because she lived on an estate on North Shore, Long Island with her lifetime partner, Polly Richards. And they had acres and acres of organic gardens. And sprayed it all the same. The difference is Marjorie Spock, Ben Spock's sister, was friends with all of the people on the North Shore estates. Robert Cushing Murphy, an environmentalist, an ornithologist, a number of wealthy people, and they banded together and brought suit. You don't spray my organic gardens. And that is the core, that's the kernel of what led to EDF and to NRDC, the Rachel Carson Council, and others. But to this day, if you go to Chemical Alley, Cancer Alley, down in Louisiana, go to North Carolina with the hogs, that's where the pollution, that's where the problems are. And we need, as Chris said, to find ways to tell those stories, to make it palpable, tangible, visible, so that the whole country will care. That is why we're here.